Hello, this is Harriet Grayson, your host and producer of Community Culture Showcase. In late 2012 into 2013, I produced a documentary, Aftermath. This was a look at the destruction and rebuilding of Misquamicut Beach in Rhode Island. It was reflective of a huge storm that settled in our area and actually starts in the Caribbean and made its way up in the end of October of 2012. What made it so unusual was, number one, it was so late in the hurricane season. So for us in Rhode Island, it was actually a good thing in terms of having less people to deal with. But in terms of other places where it struck, going from the Caribbean into making land in South Jersey, and then moving up the coast into New York, and then across Connecticut, and then into Rhode Island. The storm also broke off and went headed north, where it did also a great deal of destruction. More than 230 people lost their lives, most of them in the Caribbean, but well over 100 here in the United States. When it made landfall, it went from being a hurricane to more of a tropical storm. But that was merely an illusion in terms of its destructiveness and actually how deadly it was. So we got this idea that it was going to be a hurricane. It's downgraded. The National Hurricane Service then downgrades it to a tropical storm. But the immenseness of it, it was 1,100 miles. It was the largest storm on record, and exposed a great many people since it hit South Jersey into New York City, allowing so many people to die. And most of the people that actually did die were people who drowned. They simply did not get the message about evacuation, or they didn't take it seriously enough, and with grave consequences. So I presented this documentary as a way of telling people and giving them an education about the dangers that Mother Nature actually presents itself. So I want you to sit back and listen and enjoy in a certain way as a learning experience about Aftermath, a documentary about the destruction and rebuilding in Misquamicut Bay and all of the things that happened. Some 6 feet of sand were pushed off from this enormous storm onto Atlantic Avenue, which is the commercial hub of Misquamicut Beach. Many houses were damaged, businesses completely destroyed, and the infrastructure having to be completely remade. So sit back and listen and watch Aftermath. Thank you. Hi, this is Harriet Grayson, and I am your host and producer of Community Culture Showcase. And I have a very special treat for you today because I'm working on a documentary that will look at the destruction impacted by Storm Sandy here in the, mostly in Misquamicut Beach in Rhode Island, our favorite beach where people from all over New England come to join us. And I want to start by just giving you kind of a little geography lesson, if you will. So we start by looking at the fact that Storm Sandy hit us at the end of October, very much the end of hurricane season, and actually was never considered, as it came up here, to be classified as a hurricane. It was a superstorm, and it was a superstorm because it was literally a gigantic kind of hundreds of miles wide, and it made its way very slowly up our coast and did lots of destruction, in fact, killing lots of people in North Carolina, New Jersey, into New York City, and then here in Rhode Island. Luckily, only one person was injured, although there was lots and lots of damage. And one of the significant differences between Misquamicut Beach in Rhode Island and, for example, New York City, is that for the most part, the people here in Misquamicut do not live year-round at the beach. They are seasonal visitors, even if they own homes there. Whereas in New York City, these were people's permanent homes. And as way of an introduction, the reason why I've come to Westerly to live since 1999 was that I am a beach bum. I love the beach. And so it really did hurt me just immensely to see the incredible destruction. Hi, today we're going to talk with Chris DiPaolo, who is the station manager and owner of a wonderful radio station in Westerly, Rhode Island, that kept all of us, really just kept us alive and in motion and figuring out what was happening during the terrible disaster that impacted the whole Westerly and the beach communities during that late October storm. Well, the storm started on Sunday night, started howling, and then by Monday it was still very, very windy in my house, and we could hear the rain just like sheets. And then around 3 p.m., we lost our power. And we turned to the only place we knew we could get some really important news about what was going on was your radio station. So when did you guys, or when did you start to go on? Because you have a gorgeous voice, and it kind of, when it fills the airways like that, it was a comforting voice in a time of really people not knowing what was going to happen.
Well, I appreciate you saying that about my voice being comforting, but a lot of that, as I'm sure you know, in a storm and in a crisis situation is unplanned. And of course, the first thing I think of is, you know, we hope everybody's okay. We hope that nobody's hurt. That's the first thing that we think of. Then when we lost power at the studio. There is no generator at the studio of the radio station on 16 High Street. So I hopped in my car at the time, along with my office manager, Lauren Kleinkoff, and rushed down to the Margin Street transmitter right next to Westerly Marina. That's where the tower and transmitting facility for WBLQ is. If you're ever in that neck of the woods, you'll see it blinking at nighttime, a red blinking light on top of the tower. And fired up the generator. I had some help from RJ's Diesel. They came down that day, and they helped me get it going. So we were only down for about 15-20 minutes once the town lost power, and we broadcast right from the transmitter site. I brought my remote equipment, which I usually take on the road, and I plugged directly into the transmitter. There's a way to do that. My engineer friend Steve Conti and I have devised it so you can plug right in down there, and you have the noise of the generator in the background, and I have the internet there, and I was able to communicate with my weatherman Rick Edwards via Skype, and for as long as we had internet, Rick and I were talking back and forth. And then when the internet dropped, I used my cell phone. I was reaching in my pocket because that's usually where I carry my cell phone. But on my cell phone, it has speakerphone on it. And just like the good old-fashioned ways of doing things, back when I was a kid and I used to have a pirate radio station, and I used to have a little speakerphone out in the camper. It was a camper. That's what we broadcast from. I just held the microphone up to the cell phone, and I gave out my cell phone number on the air. People were texting me. They were calling me. And nothing too fancy about it, just holding the microphone up to the speaker. Also with Rick Edwards, the weatherman. When there was no internet, no anything, just the generator and the radio transmitter. That's how we did it. And we're right on the Pawcatuck River. AM and salt water go hand in hand. That's why the tower was built there. But never since 1949 had ownership of the radio station ever thought of there being such a flood. I mean, it survived the hurricane of 1954, which was Hurricane Carol. That was a very big hurricane. Right. And there were other storms since then, but I don't think we've ever experienced a tidal surge since 1949. Maybe in the hurricane of 38, but that was before 12:30 a.m.'s time. And the tide came up probably, the tower sits on concrete slabs, and the metal part of the tower is like up here. Let's say my hand here is the concrete slab. Here's the tower. The water level, if you follow my thumb here, probably rose like right up to there, almost to the base of the tower. If it had risen any higher, it would have shorted the tower out. So we were very fortunate in that aspect. I did have to power the station down, though, because AM AM runs on ground waves. That's how it transmits. And because the grounding radials are all out buried under the ground, the rising water caused something known as reflected power to rise, and also probably gave us a better signal. Our wattage went into overdrive. You can see the meter moving up on the transmitter almost to 1,500 watts, and we're only licensed to 1,000 watts, so I had to keep backing off. I think I powered down to about 250 watts. So while I was on the air, I was here doing all the engineering work, and I would say the power was off at the transmitter sites from about, I would say probably about 2:30 in the afternoon till about 9 o'clock at night. And we were on the air live again the next morning. There were still many folks in town without power, but we were fortunate enough to have it back.
You were very fortunate because most people didn't get it back. In fact, people couldn't believe that that little stretch of downtown had power, and most of the rest of us didn't have any power, at least for another 24 to 36 hours. Some people waited days. And it was an amazing show because there was no central place for people, or people didn't think there was a central place to get really vital information. Like, was this road open? What are we going to do with the schools? If I'm forcibly evacuated, where am I going to go? Where am I going to bring Fido? And you and the station provided that, absolutely necessary information. And I guess more luck than anything else. I mean, you guys got your power back well before anybody else did, so we were still hanging on to the radio, getting information that we basically just needed to get by. And that was very important. And you continued to do stuff for Stonington because they had a bigger problem. I mean, I think for some of those people, they didn't get their power for, like a week or so.
And I've got to say, folks like the town officials, and they all deserve kudos.
Okay. Let's go back to that day, because I as a listener, was glued to my radio, glued to your voice. Were you at all afraid for yourself or for your own personal safety or the safety of the people with you?
Well, at the point when I was by myself, Lauren Kleinkoff, the office manager, had gotten a ride out of there. Right before he got the ride out, a big tree fell down and destroyed one of the boats at Westerly Marina. Made the loudest noise. We had a couple of wind gusts, and we could hear it and feel it. You could hear the trees snapping outside, in excess of 80 miles an hour, close to 90 miles an hour, which is something that we're not used to. So yeah, I was scared. I'm in a little shack that was built back in 1949. It's kind of small. I think more of my family was worried about me being out there than I was worried about myself. I was worried about the whole community. I was worried about those in my family. I was worried about friends. I was worried about, the situation as far as people went.
Right.
And I was thinking about property damage too, but I was thinking about the people. I really hope nobody gets hurt. That was the constant thing that was in my head.
Do you have any idea how many calls you got in the first 24 hours from your listeners?
So I know that we had in excess of about 4,000 texts alone. Never mind the regular phone calls coming in.
Right.
So we know that we had quite a few.
And that's because the community. First, I don't know that all the community knew about what you were doing, but once other people started talking about it, or even people talking to each other about it, they started to listen, and then they also started to be part of this big community kind of chain link,
right.
Contacting you so that you could be the voice to let it known that this street was no good, or stay away from here, or definitely don't go out there. So your being on the air like that became the focal point for people to let the whole community know, because you were then going to broadcast it out to everybody. What is a storm surge? It is not a wall of water like you might imagine from a tsunami, where you have maybe 100-foot water coming against it. The surge really has to do with wind, high wind and gusty wind, driving the sand inland, and that's part of what the storm surge does. It picks up the sand, picks up the water, and carries it inland. And it came slowly, and it came at high tide. So all those factors together create a monster storm. Whether it was called a hurricane or not, it was Superstorm Sandy, and that's its kind of impact on Misquamicut Beach. So with me today is my guest, Coswell Cook Jr., who is the executive director of the Misquamicut Beach Association, which is responsible for a lot of the commerce and keeping everything nice and clean at the beach. He is also a member of the Westerly Town Council. We know that the Westerly Beach is a huge commercial asset to the entire community. Without a great summer season, those restaurants, those commercial enterprises, the state beach itself does not do well. So when we look into the future, what's your expectation for the next beach season starting in May? What can we expect? Can we expect everything to be in place?
I don't think we can expect everything to be in place for the beach season in 2013, but I think it'll be close. I would say that the beach would probably be at about 80%. I think everyone will pretty much be open. To what degree, I don't know.
Okay.
State Beach will be open. They'll be open for the whole season, starting their normal time, which is the second week of May is when they start every year. They'll be open. Town beaches will be open. The Westerly Residence Town Beach, and then the Misquamicut Beach, which is, we call it the New Town Beach. That's open to the public as well. So we will be there, and the Misquamicut Business Association will have our events, and we will do Spring Fest and Fall Fest and drive-in movies and classic car shows and everything that needs to be done to, get the word out there that Misquamicut's alive and well.
Okay. And you said things will be the same, some things will be different. What do you anticipate being different?
Well, there's some landmark places down there, like the Andrea Hotel. It's been there forever. So the Andrea is like this landmark. Some people know where the Andrea is and don't even know what town they're in. Right. Some people know where Misquamicut is and don't even know it's in Westerly. That's how popular Misquamicut is to Connecticut and Rhode Island and New York folks and Massachusetts people. Especially people from the Route 2 corridor going up to Hartford. I mean, everyone knows Misquamicut Beach. And I don't know if they know they're coming to Westerly.
That's true.
But the Andreas, you'll see people in Hartford and they say, I'm going to the Andrea this weekend. So the Andrea is just one of those places. But it sustained a lot of damage, and there's some different rules that Coastal Resources, CRMC, has, and DEM, Department of Environmental Management. And one of them is this 50% rule. So if 50% of the property value, of the structural value is damaged, you have to come to the current code. Clearly, most of the places in Misquamicut aren't at a new code. They were built 50, 60, or at least after the 38 hurricane they were built. Okay. The Andrea survived the 38 hurricane and didn't survive this to the point where it can be rebuilt. So the Andrea is going to do a two-phase build. A place like Patty's, another place people know, it's been there for 100 years, literally. I think that's their motto, 100 years of fun. And Patty's, their whole deck was compromised. The cement deck was just ripped apart. Their roof over their food area, their dining area was ripped off. But they've got their permits and are constructing. So those places are coming back. The Windjammer, they were lucky they had a steel structure for frame, so the walls blew out, but they can repair. Okay. So it's a lot of money, and it's a lot of work. But they're all going to be back and be open. Then there's some places, when I say some places will be different, there were a place like Sam's Snack Bar. It's been there for their...
gone.
I went down there the day after, I just couldn't even find a pole.
Right, completely devastated.
Completely gone. So Norm is the owner, and he's going to put a portable trailer sort of thing. They have some really nice ones they make nowadays. So he's going to put that up there with the deck, and then the next time there's a storm, he can pull it out.
So he'll not put any permanent structure up.
Right, because right there, you're on a barrier beach, which means there's water on both sides. Right. And there's different regulations there about rebuilding and stuff. So that'll be something that'll look different. There's a place called Little Mermaids that was down, people might know, between the Sandy Shore Motel and the Andrea on Atlantic Avenue, right around like 135 Atlantic Ave, somewhere around there. Little Mermaids was up on pilings, actually, but it was completely nothing left. Right. So I think he's going to do the trailer thing. So you're going to see some of this mobile stuff. Right. You're going to see some, maybe the restrooms at the Misquamicut Beach be portable. Not like porta potties, but those portable restrooms that look permanent, that you can take out in the event of a storm. So I think people have to start thinking that way. And then there's going to be some things like the town beach. We haven't made decisions as a council exactly yet, but it looks like leaning towards moving the whole structure back on new pilings that are higher and lifting the existing building and putting it back further off the shore and fixing the dunes. And I think you're going to see a lot more dunes than ever before. Good. So if you look at Misquamicut and look at what survived, anything that was built to the current code, State Beach, for instance, which was built in 1998 or 99, and some of the ABC Resort, which is next to the Windjammer. Okay. Those places survived perfectly because they were up on the pilings and the water went underneath them. Okay. Their septics might have been damaged, things like that, but the buildings were fine. Anything that was on the ground, forget it.
Was destroyed.
Or badly damaged. Right. So you're going to see people go up. You're going to see some buildings raised, and people come up to the code. And then you're also, a place like the State Beach, they had very mature dunes, as you'd say, that were, many, many feet wide and high. And while they got eaten away, they survive because they were built right and they're big enough. So we're going to have to build that size dune across the front of Misquamicut, which is going to change the landscape a bit.
Okay.
Views and things like that.
Right,
but I
right.
mean, if you don't do that,
We're
you're not going
waiting
to
for
have much.
disaster
You're not going to have
again.
that much left. I mean, it's
Yes.
really, during the course of the winter, it was really bad because every time there was a high tide and there was no dune put back, Atlantic Avenue was flooded. So there's some long-term solutions out there. One of them is dredging the pond and taking the sand.
Across from the State Beach.
Right. Well, actually down by where my restaurant is, down by the Weekapaug Breachway, that channel that goes in, they would dredge that whole area, which is a few $1 million project, the Army Corps of Engineers. It's been slated to be dredged for years, but there's never any money.
Right.
So I kind of resurrected the plans, and when you had the disaster, Congressman Langevin, Senator Jack Reed, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, the governor, they all came down, what can we do, what can we do? I said, get the money and get this project off the ground, because if you can get all that wonderful sand that's
Right.
just sitting there and
Right.
build dunes on the beach and replenish the beaches, without sand, nobody's coming to
the
Misquamicut.
beach, right, exactly.
So that's a long-term thing that might happen next winter, a year out, maybe two. But that's a long-term solution. There's all kinds of solutions with barrier reefs and things like that. Those are probably multi-million dollars, would need the federal government to step in and do. They have not been brought up. The other is raising Atlantic Avenue by a couple of feet and installing a drainage system that works. On the end of Atlantic Avenue, if people are familiar with Misquamicut, when you come into the main road called Winnapaug Road, you can take a right and go to the Andrea, take a left and go to the State Beach. That section, Winnapaug Road and to the right down to the Andrea, had about a $3 million drainage system put in. So instead of it just going into a hole or going into the pond,
Right.
it goes through a pump station and is pumped down to a retention pond across from the State Beach, where it goes into this pond, the sediment settles, and then the clean water goes into the pond, and then every so many years you clean out the bottom.
Right.
We have to do that on the other side of Atlantic Avenue.
Yes.
But all these things are many millions of dollars.
Okay.
The news hasn't really covered us because the only place in Rhode Island that was really destroyed was Misquamicut Beach.
Misquamicut,
You
right.
go a mile, you go 3 blocks from Atlantic Avenue, and it's like nothing happened.
Right,
So it's
right.
just down in that area, but it's so devastating for that 2-3 mile
Sure.
stretch where all the commerce happens, where people have homes. I mean, the thing that's different about us from New Jersey is, number one, there was no loss of life.
Right.
Number two, there's no refugee camps. When this first started happening, people were sending diapers, and no. Let's at least be upfront and say, if you could afford a house on Atlantic Avenue, you weren't poor.
Right.
Most of the case.
Yes.
And it was your second home.
Yes, that's right.
So at the outset of this whole thing,
Right.
it's not that kind of a disaster.
Yes.
It's not a Red Cross disaster.
Right, right.
But what it is an economic disaster.
Yes.
Because Misquamicut Beach for the economy of Westerly is so important.
Absolutely.
And for the state of Rhode Island. If you look at Westerly, Westerly is the Misquamicut State Beach, out of all the state beaches in Rhode Island, is the #1 revenue generating state beach in the whole state. And the state gets most of that money, the town gets a portion, $200,000 or $300,000 a year.
Right.
And we are, out of all of South County, they call it, which is, I think, a dozen towns.
Right.
We are the #1 generator of hotel tax income for the state and for the town, and
Right.
that helps run South County Tourism Council. In fact, in all of South County, Misquamicut, Westerly, Rhode Island, which Misquamicut's part of, makes up over 50% of the hotel tax. So you're talking, out of a dozen towns, we're 50% of the money.
Right.
And then there's about $750,000 locally generated for meals tax. It's a 1% tax. So you take just that money out,
Right.
and the town budget loses $1 million
Right.
out of a $70 million budget. That's important.
A lot of money. It's a lot of money.
And then you look at a place like the Andrea or Patty's, which each place, I can safely say, employs 100 people. What do you do without those jobs?
Right.
So the kind of recovery that we're looking at is an economic recovery. It's not a humanitarian recovery.
Right, right.
But the consequences of not recovering and ignoring the situation would be
Are
devastating,
devastating.
not just to the town's economy, but to the state's economy.
Right.
And I could see for a minute, looking at this, what 38 must have been like.
Right.
Because you looked at the landscape, and when there's 5 feet of sand on the street, and you're standing, and at your waist is the top of a stop sign,
Right.
that's just strange, and you see the gas tanks everywhere, the propane tanks everywhere, and I walked from with another town councilor of mine, Campbell Field, who used to be on the council with me at the time, and we walked from the Andrea, which is at the west end of the beach, about 2 miles all the way to my place, Seafood Haven, which is the last place on Atlantic Avenue by the bridge, and we walked down that street, and it was like a scene from a movie.
A disaster movie.
It was just unbelievable. I mean, water spouting out of mains, and nobody had really gone down there yet. So I just had to see it for myself and walk it, because I'm so involved with Misquamicut, whether it's my business or the association or just whatever. Misquamicut's my thing. So it was just, I think I cried for the first 5 minutes looking at the Andrea, and then, just walked down the street and didn't quite know what to say. I started taking pictures, and then I just kind of stopped, and then I just kept going. And it got better as you got further down. Okay. Once you get to like about 500 or something Atlantic Avenue, it stops. And then I got to my place, and from the outside it looked okay, but we have the breachways behind us, so the water came in about 3.5 feet in our building, so our equipment was ruined and things like that, but nothing compared to, Patty's or the Andrea or Sandy's Lighthouse or Sandy Shore Motel, those places. So, so that was kind of the general, feeling the day after, which, in the aftermath, I got to say the town manager made some great decisions right away. I mean, immediately the equipment was in there, the heavy equipment, getting the sand off the street. And within a week, everyone was back at their house. Okay.
What do you think is going to happen to the residential people who live right on the Atlantic? Are they going to come back?
Everyone's back.
Everyone's going to come back and fix up and start all over?
It's already moving.
Okay. And so that all of those homes will be open come the spring season?
I mean, I can't say it 100%, but I think most of them. There's a couple of homes on Atlantic Avenue that I saw one recently that was completely taken down, but I know they're building it. Okay. When this first happened, the town's job was immediately to come in and clear the roads and start doing things like that, and we stockpiled all the sand at the State Beach. So that parking lot that holds 3,000 cars is full of sand.
Right, and it's still full of sand.
Still full of sand. It's scheduled to be finished by the end of February. But at first, because the water came up so far, there was just Misquamicut is sort of like a grid. There's First Street and Second Street.
Right, yes.
And so you can kind of picture it in your head how it looks. And there's about 7 or 8 side streets. So we immediately in the aftermath were approached by a group called Serve Rhode Island, and they coordinate volunteers.
Oh, yes.
And so the Misquamicut Business Association, we put a sort of a trailer down there, just as you said, a couple of blocks away, we're outside the danger zone, up at a place called Breezeway Resort. And
oh, I know exactly where that is. Yes.
We did it on the back end of that place, and we, to date, have had over 1,000 volunteers. So we started sending them to these houses, I guess, to answer your question, and they pulled all the stuff out. Okay. And we brought it to the side of the road to separate, so we could pick up the household hazardous materials, we could pick up mattresses, and the town hired a contractor to do that. So as long as the resident brought it to the curbside.
To the curb, okay.
So we had a lot of people we were helping, a lot of elderly people too. There's some people that live there full time, and there were 5 families that were completely displaced. They might have been renters or whatnot. But for the most part, as I said, people.
It's a second home area.
Right.
Yes.
We didn't have to set up a shelter anywhere or anything like that. So it was fortunate. But all those houses, the first floors have to be gutted because you're going to have a mold problem.
Yes.
And all that. I mean, my place at Seafood Haven, we were fortunate because we're cinder block. So that, thank God, for us. But none of those homes were.
Right. Of course not. Yes.
On the first floors. And it's also brought up a lot of zoning issues. I mean, there's a lot of people that maybe illegally finished their bottom floors.
Right.
And now they're coming to the town saying, well, we want to repair this. And the town says, geez, we don't have any record.
Right.
Well, it was done in 1955 after Hurricane Carol. Well, you can't trace that. So there's a lot of issues like that. But I got to say that the town's been great about getting permits and moving forward. Coastal Resources and DEM, usually it's tough to navigate that red tape.
Yes. And
for the people that are watching, DEM, Department of Environmental Management, or DEP in Connecticut, they have jurisdiction around that whole area. Coastal Resource Management Council, CRMC, has jurisdiction also, anything within 200 feet of a coastal feature. So you got double the red tape.
Right, right.
And so they're the ones that are saying I guess what will prevent some people from opening will be things as simple but not so simple as a septic system.
Right.
Because a lot of these septic systems were just pulled out of the ground, and they were old. And next year, 2014, they're all supposed to be upgraded to these above-ground denitrification systems. And if you take a place like the Andrea, if they have to put in a denitrification system, it'll take up most of the parking lot and cost $1 million.
Right.
I mean, literally, over $1 million. And because there's no sewers down at Misquamicut.
Right.
So that is a big issue right now. So in fact, the town beach is looking at a compost system because the state beach converted to that years ago, and it works.
Yes, yes.
But you can't do that for a hotel. You can't do that for a restaurant. So there's a lot of issues with septic. There's also issues with when will the coastal resources tell us where the new dune line is, where the coastal feature is, because the coastal feature shifted. So that's going to affect where a septic can go. It's going to affect where a building can go. So those are issues. Those are big issues that are hindering some progress.
And of course, as a Westerly resident, I know that there has been a controversy about the issue of bringing sewers and a sewer line down to Misquamicut. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy stuff about, it's not even wrapped around price so much, it's just other kinds of crazy things about bringing in brand name hotels, if you could have that. I mean, really side issues that actually might be to the benefit of the town come on down the road if, in fact, you could do somewhat different kind of commercial development.
Well, you weren't born and raised in Westerly,
I
were you?
was not, and I'm an urban planner by profession.
So a lot of what I've found in my experience is that folks that come to Westerly, I just saw somebody at the post office recently, and the guy said, I've started paying attention because my wife and I vacationed here for 20 years, and then we sold our house and made our house year-round, and now we live here. And they can't understand why people would be, against the tourism, against the sewers, and it's just that's the way it is. So,
are we going to feel that, for example, the state beach or the town beach is going to be shorter in length as a result of?
Actually, if we do what we're supposed to do, what we're talking about doing at the town beach, there's going to be more beach, but there'll be a little bit less parking.
Okay. All right.
State beach is probably going to move back there doing 30 feet, so there'll be a little bit less parking, but more beach.
Okay. And of course, we do have days when 3,000 cars parking spaces is actually not enough, but they're not.
And that's just the state beach.
Right.
There's another 2,500 non-state beach parking spots. A lot of people have a misconception when they come to Misquamicut, and I would say 50% of the people that come to Misquamicut think Misquamicut is the state beach. They literally think that one parking lot and that's Misquamicut. And so I like to mess with people online when they're sending us, so is Misquamicut open? And I'm like, yeah, we're a whole village in a town. We don't close. You mean the state beach, don't you? And when I suggest, well, you could park at the Andrea, you could park at Patty's, you could park at the Wishkenow Beach, you could park at the Dunes Park. It's like, they're like, really? Because people just, they're trained. They go down the one road and and of course they wait in traffic for 4 hours.
Yes.
Instead of going online and just looking at like the 10 other ways you can get to Misquamicut. Of course, don't tell the people in Westerly I said that because they don't want the other roads crowded. But it's funny how people so now that those folks who are watching what you're doing here will know that there are other ways to get to Misquamicut, and also there's more to Misquamicut than a state beach.
Exactly. My guest is Matt Lewis, a local Westerly attorney who also happens to be a homeowner at Misquamicut Beach. And I've asked him to come and chat with me today because I'd like to be able to talk with someone who actually had some property damage, his plans for rebuilding, as well as any problems that he ran up against with the Rhode Island authorities in terms of his need for permits or whatever to comply with the rules as they are now in place. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Harriet. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me as your guest.
And now your house is about, what, about half a mile from the town beach?
About generally probably halfway between the town beach and the Dunes Beach at Weekapaug.
And can you describe for us the damage that actually happened to your property?
My house was built in 1957. We purchased it in 1980. And the house is built on pilings, telephone poles, so it's rather sturdy and actually was ahead of its time in the sense that I have a breakaway basement area for the cement walls. I'm sorry, for the wood walls. But generally speaking, I had a deck going from the house to the ocean, which was about 24 by 24. That got completely washed away. It's unbelievable, the force, because it was on pilings. It had 4x4s. It was braced with metal, but that went. Then I had about a 14-foot walkway going from that deck to a set of stairs going down to the beach. All of that was washed away and completely lost. And then we lost about 14 feet of dune. It's just unbelievable, the force of that storm and what it did, because after the storm, there was probably a 12 or 14 foot breach from what was left near the house down to the beach. So fortunately, the house itself suffered little or no damage. We lost some tiles on the roof. I lost a chimney, a metal chimney for an inside fireplace. And then down below on the lower level, we had about 2 feet of water in the basement area. So consequently, everything that was in the basement, most of it has been thrown away and trashed. That will all have to be, I'm going to have a company come in to do a complete sanitation. We've already done a partial to avoid any mold, growing.
Oh, yes.
But then the big damage was also just the sand underneath what was the part of the deck filled up with sand, and I could not get a machine in there to dig it away, so we hired some young men with strong backs.
Really, with shovels?
Yes. And actually had to shovel it out because there was just no way that you could get even a small piece of equipment in there.
Oh, okay.
And then, of course, there was about 4 feet of sand on the street side, going from the house all the way, which basically everybody suffered. As far as getting permits are concerned, the state of Rhode Island and the town of Westerly, Coastal Resources, were very, very accommodating. 10 of us along my stretch got together and we got emergency permits, which allowed us to hire a local excavation company. They came in with a couple of bulldozers, and we got permission to restore, to the extent that we could, the sand and the dune which was there prior to the storm.
Wow.
So that ended up to being a big plus. And then we also chipped in and bought some dune grass, which we, believe it or not, comes from New Jersey. And we had some students from University of Rhode Island help us plant that. But there was obviously a myriad of activity down there.
Right.
And I mean, a lot of people pitched in. Volunteers of Rhode Island were wonderful. They had people down there on weekends,
right,
helping people who were, in much more dire straits than what we were.
Right.
It seemed like if you came in from the Weekapaug end of Misquamicut, where the dunes are, Seaside Beach Club, if you looked at the first 6 or 8 houses
Right.
on the ocean,
Look fine.
looked fine, absolutely.
Right.
We talked about that. You'd never know there was a storm.
Right.
And then as you continued, westerly on Atlantic Avenue up toward the town beach, you could start to see the damage to the different houses. I would say my house was probably half and half in the middle ground.
Right.
After my house heading toward the town beach, there was a lot more damage. And I think it's because they didn't have the high dunes
Okay.
that we had, and even the higher dunes that were down at Weekapaug. The town beach, the state beach had practically no dunes at
Right.
all. That's why the water breached. Up farther by Patty's Wigwam, the Andrea Hotel,
None.
the Misquamicut Fire District beach up there, all the way up to the Pleasant View House, suffered a lot of damage.
Yes.
Somebody showed me a picture of a house on Benson Avenue, which had been swept off of its foundation.
Right. Right.
So,
You
that
think
was-
with the new restoration and is there going to now be then a concerted effort to make sure the dunes themselves are stronger?
I think they will try to do it, Harriet, but I'm not sure exactly how they can do it. I mean, you can bulldoze up from the water to bring that sand up and try to build up the
Right.
dunes. But the natural erosion, and I'm far from an engineer,
Right,
but
right.
I know a couple of people have said, like in Florida, for example, they have, I forgot what they call it, but it's like a ledge or something, maybe 30 or 40 feet out in the water, and supposedly that helps keep
Like a sandbar they
a
create.
sandbar. Okay,
That's right. They
yeah,
create
yeah.
sandbars.
Right,
Right.
and that supposedly helps the dunes. I know after the '54 hurricane, some of the business establishments, including, I believe, the Windjammer, the Andrea Hotel, and the Pleasant View Inn, they put in big boulders there, and I believe it was the Andrea that even brought in some junk cars
Oh, okay.
and dug them down and put them in, and then covered sand over it in an attempt to keep this
Right.
the dunes up, and it's probably worked for 50 years.
Right.
So,
Exactly. Hi, and my guest today is Lisa Kanicki. I'm from the Executive Director of the Westerly Pawcatuck Chamber of Commerce, And the person responsible and the organization responsible for doing this massive campaign to get that beach restored and to get business down there.
The town of Westerly called an emergency management meeting at the police department. All the police and fire and rescue and Narragansett Electric, a variety of people were there, as well as some businesses that were from Misquamicut. And it was spelled out what the situation was, how dire the situation was. At that time, businesses weren't permitted to go to their properties. The roads weren't clear yet. But what was clear was that a system needed to be put in place to protect those properties from looters or curiosity seekers. And the manager at that point really didn't have a staff to be able to administer some sort of a pass system to do that. The National Guard was being called in, state police were already there, and that was the first role that the chamber stepped up and said, we can handle that. We can serve as a satellite location of Town Hall, off-site to keep those folks out of Town Hall and to keep it closer to Misquamicut Beach. We can handle the processing of that. And we also announced at that meeting that we would help coordinate and recruit volunteers, which had already been flowing to our Facebook page saying, what can I do to help? Call me. And we announced at that meeting as well the Bring Back the Beach campaign, which, sitting at home in the middle of the storm and seeing the images come up on Facebook of Patty's and the Andrea and Sam's and a variety of others, I knew instantly we needed to respond as an organization the same way, but on a much larger scale than what we had just done 2 years earlier when our downtown was devastated by a flood.
Right. And we're talking 7 months out. It looks magnificent.
If you didn't know the storm happened.
Exactly.
And you drove down Atlantic Avenue, you might not know from driving one end to the other.
What had happened?
There's still some remnants of construction taking place. Some of it related to the storm, some of it not. But you really wouldn't know. If you looked at those images, you wouldn't believe that that's where we were 7 months ago. And officials, certainly from the top on down, FEMA, the SBA, the governor, we had a lot of assistance from the Rhode Island Small Business Development Center, Rhode Island Economic Development Department, that were on the spot within a week helping these business owners decide what to do relative to their employees that now didn't have jobs because some of those businesses would still continue through October and November. So labor officials and unemployment specialists and a variety of other folks. And then the contractors like Sharenzia Excavation. These are some of the behind-the-scene heroes, the workers at the State Beach, Larry Morazian and the DEM workers that worked tirelessly to, it was a Herculean task to accomplish what they did down there. So all of these organizations serve Rhode Island that stepped forward and ultimately provided us with over 1,600 volunteers that were coordinated through the efforts of the Misquamicut Business Association, putting them in certain locations while the chamber helped recruit them and helped provide lunches to all these volunteers and all the businesses. It was those three groups working in unison to do that piece of it. And then the funding. There's no money available by the government, really, after a storm like this for businesses. Thankfully, there is something for residents. But when it comes to businesses, you have to have a contingency plan. You have to have a rainy day fund, or you have to have personal savings, something to help you. But we know that realistically, these, in many cases, are very small, family-owned businesses.
Sure, been around for a long time.
They have. And while many of them had 2 and 3 different types of insurance policies in place to protect them, the amounts that were awarded to them after the storm were appalling. And you'd have one policy saying, well, that's not wind damage, that's water damage. And the water policy saying, no, that's not water, that's this, it's flood. And nobody wants to pay out, even though as a business owner, you've been paying in for years.
Of course.
It's a 501c3 charitable organization called the Greater Westerly Chamber Foundation. We've used that for a number of wonderful charitable purposes over the years. We also use that for the flood fund. So we create a line item within that simply with monies dedicated to this one particular project.
Okay.
Monies would come in and it would be deposited into that line item. And one of the things we're most proud of is that 100% of every dollar that was donated to the beach recovery efforts went to the beach recovery efforts.
Right.
And then within the monies that came in, the vast majority were dedicated to the businesses themselves for grants that we could give out quickly. And we had the first checks within their hands within a month.
Wow.
And some of the criteria included the economic impact of that business on the community.
Oh, okay.
So a business that creates 150 jobs does more for the town of Westerly than a business that creates 3 jobs.
Right.
They have a higher weight in that one category. A business that has hotel rooms, because hotel rooms support restaurants, amusements, ice
Right.
cream shops, the flip-flop stores, you name it. So hotel rooms had a little bit higher of a criteria.
Right.
A business that's open year-round, that's generating and bringing people and families in year-round that are supporting the entire Westerly economy. Businesses that generate the meal tax. So all of
Right.
these sorts of things. And then it was, did they have insurance, and what level of insurance did they have? Some businesses, no insurance whatsoever.
Right.
How do you deal with that versus a business that took out of their profit and was very responsible and had 3 or 4 different types of insurance to protect them from this, but still we're looking at out-of-pocket expenses of $50, $60, $100,000.
Right. Have you basically helped almost all the businesses there?
Every single business that applied for a grant got one.
Oh,
At some level.
At some level.
Right. Actually, it wasn't based on who they were, because as a Chamber of Commerce, usually what a Chamber of Commerce does is assist its members only. We gave out grant money to any business.
Right.
Membership was not a requirement in this whatsoever. We did have a cap that we would only go up to 75% of your losses, because as a business owner, you really, again, have to be responsible.
Right. Now, how did that actually work? Did the business request help, or did?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And they told you what they wanted.
Each week I'd send an email out to the businesses on behalf of the Chamber and the MBA saying, what do you need this week? And they would tell us, I need 6 people, and this is what I need them to do.
Right.
So we would have a job list to work off of, and the
Oh,
Chamber
okay.
would gather that job list. And then each week Serve Rhode Island would take that information and as well as the information from the cottages, people that own homes or cottages,
Right.
that the MBA was gathering that.
And the MBA, we should tell people, is Misquamicut
Misquamicut Business Association was the partner. They would deal with the residents to find out what their needs were. We would deal with the businesses. Then that would be compiled into one list, provided to Serve Rhode Island, and they would essentially send out a mass email to their database of about 10,000 volunteers. Those folks would respond. We would know who was coming in. Buses were provided in the early days by the Washington Trust Company.
Okay.
Volunteers would show up. They would bring their own rakes and shovels, and we got donated, the Chamber, hundreds of gloves and trash bags and dust masks and wading boots and a variety of other equipment from United Builder Supply and the Johnny Cake Center and other sources where we put the word out we needed bottled water and some of these other items that were necessary in the cleanup. So everyone was doing their part to get the volunteers, to coordinate the volunteers, to provide the equipment to the volunteers, and then to feed the volunteers.
Sure.
Each week, you know.
As we look further on, say next season, what changes do you think, if any, will be still going on? What really else needs to be done, either by the state or by the town, to even improve what's happened so far?
Well, we've got the iconic structures that need to be returned. We need the Andrea back. We need Maria's Seaside Cafe back.
Okay.
We need the Westerly Town Beach put back to its condition that it was, or in some new fashion that's going to stand the test of time. That's the first thing. There's still infrastructure improvements that are needed down there. We need the dredging of Winnapogue Pond.
Yes.
That's in the top 3 things. Some could argue it might even be number 1. We need sewers from Misquamicut.
Oh, yes.
We need sewers.
Yes.
The people that oppose sewers would use this storm and say, see, that's why we shouldn't have sewers, because someday Misquamicut's going to go out to sea and all that money would be wasted. The people that are in favor of sewers say, here's the perfect example of why we need sewers. Look what happened to all these septic systems, and where do you think all that went? And a septic system for a small business to replace, which isn't covered by insurance,
Right.
I know of one business, it was $130,000 for one small business.
So, what is the future of our beaches? In particular, we look at Misquamicut Beach. We saw what happened to it. So I have with me a great guest, Dave Prescott from Save the Bay, which is a wonderful local environmental group. So Dave, let's talk about the future.
Sure.
So we talked about I've talked with other guests about what happened that fateful day.
Yep.
What's happening in terms of rebuilding. And the bigger issue, though, is what's going to happen. What is really the future of our beach and all the other beaches that are impacted by what's going on in the climate and the world?
Well, I think we're right now seeing a lot of change. And if you look back over since 2010, we were talking about this before, that we've seen really 4 major storms. We've seen the floods of 2010. We saw Tropical Storm Irene. We saw Superstorm Sandy, and then we saw the blizzard. And each one of them can be attributed to climate change and the impacts that we're actually seeing from more frequent, more intense storms, more damaging storms and whatnot, each in their own different way. It's hard. And then on top of those storms, you also take the impacts of higher sea levels. So since the beginning of the century, we've seen Rhode Island has one of the oldest tide gauges in the country. Or the oldest one in the country. And basically, we've seen a 10-inch rise in sea level since the beginning of the century. Actually, since, a little bit less than 100 years. We've seen about 10, 11 inches of sea level rise. So when you put that on top of our beaches, our coasts, our marshes, there's a big impact. And especially when you have a storm such as like Superstorm Sandy that comes in there, is that 100 years ago, if Superstorm Sandy hit exactly the same, it would be very different. Because today you have that additional 10 inches of water on there. Looking at the state beach, because of the way the structure was built there, it did survive pretty well. There was some damage, obviously, and whatnot, but it survived pretty well. The one thing it didn't survive, obviously, was all those dunes. And those dunes, for the most part, got wiped out. But those dunes are so important. Those dunes are natural features. I've been told that basically the last time that dune system there was as destroyed as it was after Superstorm Sandy was back in the blizzard of '78. So we're talking about 35 years of that dune system being nourished by the beach, sand coming up onto the dune itself, nourishing it, growing dune grass and other plants to help that, and forming not only the several dunes behind it, some of the back dunes and whatnot. So that was actually a good thing. So when you have these natural barriers, natural like a dune on a coastal barrier, that definitely helps being behind it because it provides that protection.
Now, I've noticed that a lot of the private owners and some of the businesses have actually recreated the dunes and actually dune grass, but for example, the state beach is not doing that, and there's a particular reason, I guess.
Yes. So this winter we're going to be watching a very interesting project going on right now. Some of the funding that has come from the feds from Superstorm Sandy is going to restore the beach basically back to when Misquamicut State Beach was first built back in the late 50s, early 60s. So this is actually an Army Corps project, and the plan as of this point right now, it's seen different. It's been shaped different ways, but the newest in the plan that's going forward is that they're going to truck in about 3,000 truckloads of sand over the course of about 2 months, starting in March and ending sometime early May. And we're going to see 3,000 truckloads of sand. So I think it's approximately 90,000 cubic yards of sand, which is huge.
Yes.
If you remember how all that sand that was piled on Misquamicut State Beach, as the pyramids and whatnot.
Right.
I'm trying to remember the numbers. I want to say it was somewhere between like 60 and 70,000 cubic yards. So we're talking even more sand coming back there. So that's why at this point the State Beach is holding off on their dune grass planting until after that project is done.
And now they're going to then recreate the dunes as a basis?
Yeah, so part of the project is that they're not only going to recreate the dunes, but they're also going to be pushing some of the sand back into the water. So based upon the profile that was taken by the Army Corps back in, like I said, the late 50s, it's being restored back to that time. Now, obviously, we've had quite a difference between now and then. So it's going to look very different, and it's going to...
it's actually going to be more beautiful.
It's going to be huge.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the interesting thing, too, is that even after Sandy, when Sandy first hit, it looked like there was nothing left of the beaches.
Right.
And
6 feet on Atlantic Avenue instead of on the beach.
Exactly. And even, even before that sand got put back on the dunes, we watched Mother Nature bring the sand back on the beach. And all of a sudden, you have this beautiful beach. And that was one of the amazing things. Nature can be very resilient if we allow it to be. And that's what we've seen. And so a lot of times it is best to kind of let Mother Nature do what it wants to do. A beach is a very dynamic system. So these barriers, especially down in Misquamicut and whatnot, they want to move. That sand wants to move in, it wants to move out, it wants to move in, it wants to move out. And when you allow it to do that, then the beach can survive and be healthy and whatnot. It's when you put structures in the way, whether it's a building or a seawall or whatnot, that actually can change those dynamics and not allow the beach to actually move, where you can sometimes have some issues.
Would that mean that the pavilion itself is going to change, or they're going to keep they'll have to change some of the ways to get onto the beach if they're actually going to make it bigger, but the pavilion itself is going to be...
No, I don't think there's any...
Okay.
That's not going to change at all. That's going to stay as it is, and you're right. So if there's more sand, they may have to change around how you get to the ramps and whatnot, and, but...
And I heard decrease the number of car spaces in the parking lot.
Yep, there's a potential it's going to decrease just based upon that much sand. So the sand's going to go in towards the water and also back onto the dunes and whatnot. So it's going to be a project to watch. So whether good or bad, we'll find out. I mean, you're getting sand back on there. Is this, one of the issues is that, and especially in all the coastal ponds we have on the South Coast, is that we decided back 50s and 60s and whatnot to basically open them up, to allow those that lived on the ponds to come out, to allow those in the ocean to come in and whatnot. But one of the things that it did was being open on a constant basis. And if looking back historically, these salt ponds were only open during the biggest of storms. So if you have a big hurricane or a big nor'easter, that would rip a hole in the front barrier there, and then it would stay open for a day, a couple weeks, a couple months, or however long. When we put permanent barriers in there, permanent breachways in there, and I'm talking about, we have basically 4 breachways on the south coast there of Rhode Island from Narragansett to Westerly, is that basically we created a giant funnel to allow all that sand to basically come into and fill up our ponds, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing all of our ponds. So we're looking at Winnapaug, we're looking at Quanticotok, we're looking at Ninigret, we're looking at Point Judith, that are basically filling in with sand that normally would keep making its way down the beach. So we're not going to destroy those breachways, and I don't think anyone's asking to do that, but that is one of the negative impacts of putting a permanent breachway that you're sucking in sand. So even though 90,000 cubic yards of sand are going to go on the beach, eventually it's going to end up back in the pond, potentially filling that back up. However, we have some other projects that we're working on right now to try to get some of that sand dredged out of there. But once again, it's not a one-shot deal. These are constant, all-the-time maintenance. This is something we decided to do, and you have some constant maintenance that you need to keep up and keep doing that.
Is the Corps of Engineers going to go ahead and start dredging the pond behind Misquamicut?
No, they're not. No. They're not involved. Initially, that was a thought with this 90,000 cubic yards that they were going to go in there and actually dredge. But because the Sandy funds, from what I understand, the Sandy funds needed to be used by I think either the end of June, or beginning of July, somewhere around there. That there wasn't enough time to put a project together to be able to dredge that out. So this is Plan B, which is basically trucking the sand in to put it back in the beach to be able to utilize those funds. However, there are several other groups that are looking at this point of dredging the Winnipesaukee and some of the other ponds as well. So we're working towards that because
they'll kill the ponds eventually.
Eventually they'll fill in. I mean, they will eventually fill back in. I mean, once again, that's nature doing what it does best.
Right.
And part of when these breacheways were first built, there was an understanding that they needed to be maintained and they needed to be dredged, but based upon financial issues and whatnot, that just hasn't happened. So, and because of that, we've lost a lot of things. We've lost habitat, we've lost eelgrass, we've lost some of the species that live in there as well. So we do want to restore some of these ponds. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet that says, okay, if we do this once, we'll never have to do it again.
Right.
Things are always changing. Very, very, very dynamic environment, very dynamic. Sand's always moving. So,
the other thing that we talked about before, which is highly controversial, is the idea of putting down permanent sewers. From the town of Westerly has sewers to bring them down to the beach and put them on Atlantic Avenue. What in your view is the pros and cons of doing anything like that?
Well, I think anytime there are some regulations already. State regulations through our Coastal Resources Management Council in terms of infrastructure on barriers. And in most places, if they're not developed, they don't allow to put new infrastructure down there. In the case of Misquamicut, and I'll tell you exactly our perspective of when that went forward, is that there's not a huge amount of options. Yes, you can put in new septic systems and whatnot, and you heard about all the damage to the septic systems that from Sandy as well. I think someone was saying somewhere around 500 septic systems were in one form or another damaged. So putting infrastructure there is one option. Is it the best option? That's really a community decision that has to decide that. You know, our perspective was that in looking at the big picture of sewers in Misquamicut, our perspective was that in order to protect the pond and to deal with the homes and the households where they're down there and whatnot, that we felt that sewer systems were the best option. However, there has to be stopgaps that are put in the way in case another big storm like Sandy or something bigger, like a 38 comes along, whereas that you're able to shut off certain sections of the sewer system there so that it doesn't, so that you're not, if it breaks open during a storm, you're not pumping raw sewage everywhere there. There's different, and you also have to look at much stronger planning and zoning. You have to have very, very strong planning and zoning in order to do with that. And
well, historically, of course, Napattree was abandoned in terms of any kind of homes, any permanent structures at all, and remains simply just the beach.
Yep, you're right. I mean, back after the 38, you know, it was a decision to not rebuild on Fort Road and not rebuild Napattree. And you know, Napattree is a perfect example of when you allow nature to do what it wants, you can watch the whole process. So if you look back, they've had some shoreline change maps on CRMC's website now for I think since the early 2000s. And they basically look back at what does the shoreline look at. Every single piece of shoreline around the state shows what the erosion rate is. Napattree, once again, is a great example because after it was decided not to rebuild on, that barrier just remained natural. It had a beautiful dune system, beautiful beach, and whatnot. And everyone says, you know, it's exactly the same as it was back in 38. Several coastal geologists I've seen this from is that it looks similar, but it has actually moved one whole width back. So based upon, you know, storms and whatnot, if you just take exactly what Napattree looks like and you take that and you move it up one whole width, that's exactly what it's done. And that's what happens. The same thing's true at Sandy Point. You know, Sandy Point used to be attached to Napattree, and then it broke off, and it's been moving basically in a northwest direction. Same thing. That's moved several hundred feet over the last 20 years. That's what a natural system looks like. That's when you don't have
Any barriers?
Any barriers or any of any sort.
One of the ideas, we had talked about this earlier, was actually if you had no permanent structures on Atlantic Avenue, you moved everything to shore, to Route 1A, then you could build up 1A because that's high enough and far enough.
You know, one of the things we were talking about is that, you know, it's a place like Sam's Snack Bar that got completely destroyed, and you know, when I went by there, I couldn't believe it. You know, I've spent time there, I've surfed in front, you know, and you can't believe it. But then they came back and they brought a mobile unit in there, and that potentially, you know, that's one of the ways to look at it, is that, you know what, when a storm comes, you can pack up and leave. And you don't have all that money and all that infrastructure that's as a permanent structure on a beach that wants to move, and you allow that beach to move, and then you come back and move it back the next time after the storm. So that is a very good model to look at. You know, it's not just Westerly that's looking at this. It's all communities up and down the East Coast are really looking at this, because when you take into account the predictions they have for sea level rise, you know, that by the year 2100, and you know, and we're not going to be alive then, you know, but and if you look at those models and the predictions they're doing, they're looking at 3 to 5 feet, and that's also what CRMC is using as a model too. They're basically saying that we're predicting 3 to 5 feet of sea level rise by the year 2100. You look at living on the coast, you have to assess, you know, what risks can we really take? You know, can we keep rebuilding year after year? If we get hit every year with another storm, can we keep doing this personally, mentally? You know, never mind financially. You know, financially, obviously, it's a huge hit, not only to the homeowner, but also could be for the tax structure and everything like that. Now, March floods, 2010, we're almost 4 years past, but they got funding to buy out those properties right along Canal Street because they're vulnerable. Well, maybe that needs to be looked at other places that are really vulnerable along the coast, not just along the river and whatnot. But that's a really good model. The town of Westerly is also looking at, they're in the process of moving the town beach pavilion back.
Yes.
You know, they're looking at moving the septic system back. So there are options out there. One of the very positive things that's coming out of this whole thing is a big planning process that's being undertaken by Coastal Resources Management Council and URI Coastal Resources Center. They're going through a process of a SAMP, and a SAMP stands for a Special Area Management Plan. And they have a handful of SAMPs all around the state. Well, this SAMP is known as the Shoreline Change SAMP, or also known as the Beach SAMP, although it doesn't just focus on the beach. It focuses more on shoreline change on all of our shorelines throughout Rhode Island. So not just on the South Coast right now, even though we're focusing on the South Coast at this point right now. But this process that they're going through right now is going to be looking at our vulnerability and looking at the options out there and assessing the risks and getting more research to understand, you know, how much sand is out there, where is it going, why are we losing it, you know, and to bring all that data together to then be able to come up with some stronger regulations and to help communities make decisions when they're thinking about these things. And it's a really good thing for everyone to be involved in. Climate change does not just affect those that live on the coast. Climate change affects every single one of us. And if we want to be part of, if we want to have a say, we have to be coming to these places and speaking our mind and saying what we have to lose and listening to the experts and understanding truly what are the risks. And I implore everyone.
So anybody from the public can actually participate.
Yep. And I think that's how it's going to be successful. The best thing to do is get on the listserv. They have a really easy website, which is beachsamp.org, and you can get right on the listserv there.
Okay.
You'll find out about the meetings. But once again, it's only going to be effective if everyone gets involved, and then look at it on a much more longer term scale. So, but that's a hard thing to do because I think a lot of it is emotional. A lot of it you want to get that normalcy back, but the other reality is that we're in a new normal right now in terms of climate change, and again,
this is just the start.
More frequent storms, more intense storms, higher sea levels. I mean, you keep naming them off, you know, and you know, we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable. We're not only vulnerable on the coast, on our beaches, we're vulnerable in the marshes behind us. Our marshes are drowning in place because of these higher sea levels. And if you have a marsh and you have a house behind it, and again that marsh can't migrate back, then that marsh is going to die. And that marsh is just as important, if not in some cases more important, than that front barrier system there, because that's what's going to help us in terms of flood capacity and water from storm surge and everything like that. So I think there's a lot of changes happening with all of our habitats, and we really need to understand that better.
So I hope that you've enjoyed and learned something from Aftermath, my documentary about the destruction and rebuilding of Misquamicut Beach. It is an important lesson that we have not perhaps learned enough about what can and should be done, if not to avert a storm, since we cannot control Mother Nature, but actually to figure out ways that we can preserve lives and property and still have a viable community that understands and realizes the strength and the power of Mother Nature. My goal is to create a new documentary. This one focused much more on what did we learn. 5 years later, what have we learned that we can now go forward with? What has changed in the aftermath of Storm Sandy? That is mostly the focus of my new documentary. We know one thing for sure, and that is that we changed some of the policy of the National Hurricane Center. Before Storm Sandy, the National Hurricane Center in Miami would cease to have overview and purview of all of the warnings, the evacuation, all of the things that were happening because the storm stopped being a hurricane and simply became a tropical depression or became something less than a hurricane. The new policy after Storm Sandy is that the National Hurricane Center, with all of its scientists, all its meteorologists, all its ability to get the news out, will remain in charge under its purview, regardless of whether or not when it hits the United States, it isn't still a hurricane. So that's an important message, and that has been changed. But the second thing, and probably more important than anything else, is this whole concept of a strategic retreat. Is there a point at which we simply cannot have people living so very close to the coastline? Here in Rhode Island, we have a perfect example of strategic retreat, not necessarily planned as such, but what actually happened in Napattree Point, near Watch Hill, after the hurricane of 1938. On Napattree Point, there were some 30 cottages and homes. After that hurricane, they were all destroyed. And the question became whether to rebuild. And there was a conscientious decision made not to rebuild. And if you go to Napattree Point today, you'll find a beautiful coastline, but in fact, no houses. The remains of an old fort, but again, no houses. And in fact, Napattree Point has shifted and changed in terms of its whole coastline as a result of Mother Nature. But there was no fears about saving lives because people were not living there. So that is an example of strategic retreat, and that is something that we're going to talk about in the next documentary. There have been examples of that also done in Staten Island, where Storm Sandy hit mercilessly and killed a number of people. A bunch of homes were bought out by the city with, I'm sure, federal and state money, and it's no longer going to be a place where people live. It's simply going to be a park. These are other places along the coastline where, in fact, we might start to think about strategic retreat. So I hope that this has piqued your interest and that you now want to go forward and can't wait to see the next documentary, which will be about the things that we've learned 5 years after Superstorm Sandy. So join me again sometime in the future when we'll talk about what the lessons to be learned. Thank you very much. This is Harriet Grayson, your host and producer of Community Culture Showcase.